Before New York, before New York had its skyline. Before Paris had its lights. Before Washington drew borders on maps. There was London. A city born on the banks of a silent river, wrapped in fog, and forged in blood and empire. A place where kings were crowned and executed. Where plague swept through cobbled streets, and where the heartbeat of an empire once echoed around the globe. But London didn't begin as a world capital. It began in the mud. This is the story of how a patch of wild land on the River Thames grew into the most influential city on earth. And it starts long before the Romans. Before the Empire, wild London, before 43 AD. Long before London was called London. Before there were bricks, before there were walls. There was a forest. Thick, tangled, and humming with life. The area we now call London was once wild marshland, dense woodlands, and rolling hills, home to tribes like the Trinovans and Catavilani, Celtic peoples who lived in scattered settlements. They didn't write. But they carved stories into stone and memory. And what made this place so different? The River Thames. Wider, slower, and far more dangerous than it is today, the Thames was the beating artery of life, connecting inland trade routes to the sea. To the tribes, it was sacred, a spirit in motion. They threw weapons, jewelry, and even human sacrifices into it, believing the river had power to shape fate. These early Britons were fierce and spiritual. They painted their bodies, built wooden forts, and fought over honor and land. But their world was about to change forever. Because something was coming, from the south. Londinium rises, the Roman arrival, 43 AD, 410 AD. In 43 AD, the Romans invaded. Not for the first time, but this time, they stayed. Marching under Emperor Claudius, they cut through resistance like fire through dry leaves. The tribes couldn't match Roman strategy, or steel. But here's what's fascinating. The Romans didn't build their city on top of a massive tribal capital. They chose an empty spot. Why? Location. The Thames narrowed at a perfect crossing point. It was high enough to avoid flooding, but close enough to the sea for trade ships to dock. And so they built Londinium. A Roman town. A port. A promise of order. Streets were laid in grids. Markets flourished. Stone replaced wood. Public baths, temples, forums, everything the Romans brought, they brought to Londinium. It became one of the most important cities in Roman Britain. But peace wouldn't last. In 60 AD, a name emerged like thunder. Boudica. A queen. A rebel. A storm in human form. After Roman soldiers flogged her and violated her daughters, Boudica united tribes in fury. Her army razed Londinium to the ground. Burned it. Killed everyone who remained. Ash from that destruction still lies under parts of modern London. Rome, humiliated, struck back. Rebuilt. Stronger. With stone walls, gates, and discipline. And so Londinium endured. By the 3rd century, it was one of the largest Roman cities north of the Alps. But even empires decay. By the early 400s, Rome had bigger problems. Germanic tribes were pouring into the empire. Troops were recalled. Britain was abandoned. Londinium was left behind. Silent. Crumbling. A ghost city waiting to be reborn. Shadows and Kings, Saxon and Viking London, 410 to 1066 AD. After Rome, chaos. For nearly 2 centuries, London drifted in and out of the fog. Into this power vacuum came the Anglo-Saxons, Germanic tribes from present-day Germany and Denmark. They didn't settle inside the old Roman walls. Instead, they built a new settlement just to the west, a place called Londonwick. It was simpler. Wooden houses. Open-air markets. But it was a beginning. Then came the Vikings. From the north, like thunder across the sea. In 842, they sacked London. Again in 851. They weren't just raiders anymore, they wanted land. This pressure forced the Saxons to return to the old Roman site. Within the walls, it was safer, defensible. And so London moved back into itself. A dance of survival. By the 9th century, King Alfred the Great rebuilt London's defenses and turned it into a fortified town. Slowly, trade returned. Religion flourished. Churches rose. London was reawakening. But change was coming. Big change. The Normans arrive, birth of a capital, 1066 to 1200. In 1066, the sky over England changed forever. After the death of King Edward the Confessor, 3 men claimed the throne. And from Normandy came William the Conqueror. He crossed the Channel, fought the Battle of Hastings, and won. But here's the twist. William wasn't crowned in Winchester, the old seat of power. He was crowned in London, in Westminster Abbey. That moment turned London from a growing city into the capital of England. To secure his power, William built the most iconic symbol of Norman strength: the Tower of London. Originally a timber fort, it soon became a stone fortress, a prison, a palace, and a place of execution. And that's how London would grow, not just in size, but in Part 2. Part 2. London, by the 1300s, was no longer just a city. It was a living thing. Its streets pulsed with trade. Its people spoke a rough, evolving English. Its skyline was pierced by spires, not skyscrapers. And in every alley, every tavern, every church, a new kind of urban identity was forming. But behind the growth, a storm was gathering. And when it struck, London would bleed. The Black Death, 1348. In the summer of 1348, something arrived in London that no wall could stop. It came with ships from the continent. On fleas. On rats. They called it the Great Pestilence. You know it as the Black Death. No one knew what it was. But they saw what it did. Within months, half of London was dead. People died in their homes. In the streets. Priests refused last rites. Gravediggers collapsed from exhaustion. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned. London was a city of shadows and silence. But strangely, this horror reshaped the future. With so many dead, labor was scarce. Serfs demanded wages. Guilds grew. A middle class began to emerge. From death came change. The Age of Shakespeare, 1500s. As plague faded and peace returned, London entered a golden age of language, learning, and performance. The city expanded rapidly, its population doubling by the end of the 1500s. And on the south bank of the Thames, in a district called Southwark, something extraordinary happened. The birth of modern theatre. This wasn't theatre for nobles. This was for everyone: merchants, beggars, bakers, drunkards. And one man captured it all better than anyone else. William Shakespeare. With a pen as sharp as any sword, he turned the chaos of London life into poetry. All the world's a stage, he wrote. And nowhere was that more true than in the Globe Theatre, built in 1599. His plays, Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, weren't just literature. They were windows into a city finding its voice. The Great Fire, 1666. Then, just as London reached new heights, it burned. On the night of September 2, 1666, a fire broke out in a bakery on Pudding Lane. Within hours, flames leapt from building to building. Wooden houses. Tightly packed alleys. Dry summer air. A perfect storm. For 4 days, the city burned. By the end, 13,000 homes, 87 churches, and most of medieval London lay in ash. But here's what's remarkable. Only 6 people were officially recorded dead. Though the true number was likely higher, the fire did something the plague never could. It cleansed the city. It destroyed the rats. It ended centuries of filth. And it opened the door for rebirth. A new London rises. From the ashes came ambition. Enter Sir Christopher Wren, the architect who would shape the skyline of post-fire London. His masterpiece? St. Paul's Cathedral, a dome of white stone rising above a city reborn. Wren rebuilt 52 churches, each one a work of symmetry, sound, and spirit. Streets were widened. Buildings made of brick and stone replaced timber. London didn't just rebuild. It reinvented. It was a phoenix. But even as beauty returned, inequality grew. The poor packed into slums. The rich built grand houses in the West End. London was becoming a city of extremes. The empire's nerve center, late 1600s. As the 17th century closed, London wasn't just England's capital anymore. It was the engine of an empire. Ships left its docks for India, the Americas, Africa. Trade boomed. Coffeehouses buzzed with politics and poetry. The Bank of England was founded in 1694. But there was a darker side. Slavery. London's wealth was built, in part, on human lives bought and sold. The Port of London profited from the triangle trade. Goods to Africa, slaves to the Americas, sugar back to London. For every elegant drawing room, there was a plantation. For every gold coin, a price paid in blood. This contradiction would haunt the city for centuries. By the dawn of the 1700s, London had been burned, rebuilt, risen again. It had produced geniuses, buried kings, and birthed an empire. But its greatest transformation was yet to come. Because something was stirring in the coal, in the steam, in the gears of machines. The Industrial Revolution was coming. And it would. Part 3. The entire history of London. Steam, smog, and the Victorian machine. 1700s, 1900s. Word count, 2000. The 18th century opened with a quiet hum. A new kind of energy. You could hear it in the clang of hammers, the hiss of steam, and the whistle of trains not yet built. London was on the edge of becoming something it had never been before. Not just a capital city. Not just the heart of an empire. But the beating engine of the modern world. And that engine was about to roar to life. The Industrial Revolution begins, 1700s. In the early 1700s, London still moved at the pace of horses, carts, and wind-powered ships. But underground, something was shifting. Coal mines in the north fed fires in London's homes and factories. Steam engines, pioneered by men like Thomas Newcomen and James Watt, were changing everything. London became a magnet for labor. Thousands fled the countryside and poured into the city. They came for work. For wages. For survival. And they found a world of contrasts. Elegant drawing rooms in Mayfair. Grim tenements in Whitechapel. Banks rising in the city. Children picking coal in Southwark. This was the price of progress, invention and inequality. The railways arrive, early 1800s. By the 1820s, iron rails stretched from London's heart to the outer edges of Britain. Railways shrunk time. Journeys that once took days were now hours. Stations like Euston, Paddington, and King's Cross became cathedrals of movement. Goods flooded into the capital, cotton, coal, grain, ideas. The city expanded outward. The population soared past 2 million. But not everyone benefited. Many Londoners lived in slums, their homes packed, air foul, water filthy. Disease spread faster than trains. In 1854, a single outbreak of cholera killed over 10,000 people. One man, Dr. John Snow, mapped the deaths and traced the source to a contaminated water pump on Broad Street. It was a breakthrough. A moment where science met suffering, and won. Dickensian London. No writer captured this era better than Charles Dickens. He didn't write about kings or heroes. He wrote about the boy in the alley. The pickpocket. The orphan. The clerk who lived on the edge of starvation. In Oliver Twist, Bleak House, and Great Expectations, Dickens peeled back the curtain on Victorian London. He showed the world the city behind the city. Where wealth sat next to ruin. Where fog wasn't poetic, it was pollution. Where children worked, begged, or starved while ladies danced in glittering ballrooms. London was the most powerful city in the world. And one of the cruelest. Queen Victoria and the Age of Empire, 1837 to 1901. When Queen Victoria took the throne in 1837, London already ruled Britain. But soon, it would rule a quarter of the world. This was the height of the British Empire. India, Canada, Australia, vast parts of Africa, all controlled from offices in London. The city became the capital of capital. Banks multiplied. Museums were built to house treasures from across the globe. Whitehall and Westminster grew more powerful than ever. Victoria reigned for 63 years. She watched her city transform from smoky streets to electric lamps, from carriages to early cars. By her death in 1901, London's population was over 6 million. But beneath the grandeur, tensions simmered. Workers protested. Women demanded the vote. Immigrants arrived from Ireland, the Caribbean, and Eastern Europe, often met with suspicion and fear. London was growing. And changing. Shadows of revolution and reform. As the 19th century ended, politics boiled. Labor unions emerged. The Chartists demanded democracy. Karl Marx wrote part of Das Kapital in a Soho library. And women, long excluded, refused to stay silent. The suffragettes, led by figures like Emmeline Pankhurst, marched through London streets. They chained themselves to railings. They were arrested. Beaten. Force-fed. But they kept coming. London had always been a city of kings and merchants. Now it was a city of movements. A place where voices could rise, and sometimes, finally, be heard. By the dawn of the 20th century, London was the largest city on earth. The richest metropolis in history. The political brain of the world's biggest empire. But empires crack. And shadows fall. And soon, this mighty city would face two of the darkest trials in its entire history. World War I. And World War II. What happened next would change London and the world forever. Blitz and rebirth, London in the 20th century, 1900 to 2000. The next part will cover World War I and the home front. The Blitz and post-war reconstruction. Swinging London of the 1960s. The rise of modern multiculturalism. London's transformation at the end of the millennium. Part 4. The entire history of London. Blitz and rebirth, London in the 20th century. 1900 to 2000. Word count, 2000. The 20th century didn't ask permission. It arrived with thunder, trenches, and transformation. London, once a city of empire and industry, was about to be tested in ways it had never imagined. Not by the march of progress. But by fire. By bombs. And by a fight for its very soul. The Great War, 1914 to 1918. When World War I broke out in 1914, London stood as the command post of a global empire. But this war was different. It didn't just happen over there, it came home. Air raids by German Zeppelins marked the first time London civilians were targeted from the sky. Blackouts and bomb shelters became part of daily life. So did queues for food and stories of sons who'd never return. Over 100,000 Londoners fought in the trenches. Tens of thousands didn't come back. And those who did, were changed forever. Women, war, and the vote. The war transformed more than just borders. With men at the front, women stepped in as nurses, tram conductors, munitions workers. They ran the city. And when the war ended, they weren't about to return quietly to the shadows. In 1918, women over 30 won the right to vote in Britain. By 1928, it was full suffrage. London's women had tasted power. And they weren't giving it back. Between the wars, jazz, poverty, and political storms. The 1920s and 30s brought contrasts. There was the glitz of jazz clubs in Soho, the rise of radio and the BBC, the first red buses and black cabs becoming icons. But also massive unemployment, crumbling slums, the general strike of 1926, where millions of workers walked off the job, and the rise of fascism, led by Oswald Mosley and the British Union of Fascists. London, always a city of diversity, faced growing anti-Semitism and racial tension. But when Mosley's black shirts tried to march through the Jewish East End in 1936, Londoners stood their ground. The Battle of Cable Street wasn't fought by soldiers, it was won by dockworkers, mothers, students, and ordinary people who shouted, "They shall not pass." The Blitz, 1940 to 1941. Then came the Second World War. And with it, the Blitz. Night after night, German bombers rained destruction on the city. From September 1940 to May 1941, London was bombed for 57 consecutive nights. Whole streets were reduced to rubble. Fires lit up the sky. Over 30,000 Londoners were killed. But the city did not break. In the underground stations, families sang to stay calm. Churches stood with shattered roofs. St. Paul's Cathedral remained blackened but unbowed, a symbol of resilience. And when Winston Churchill declared, "We shall never surrender," London believed him. Because it had already proven it wouldn't. Post-war London, rebuilding from the ashes. When peace came in 1945, London was a scarred giant. But out of the ashes came a new vision. A fairer, more just city. The NHS was founded in 1948, offering free healthcare for all. Public housing projects, or council estates, rose where bombs had fallen. A welfare state took root. And a new wave of immigrants, especially from the Caribbean, India, and Pakistan, arrived to help rebuild. They brought music, food, stories, and faced racism, housing discrimination, and struggle. But they stayed. And London changed. Forever. Swinging London, the 1960s. By the 1960s, the grey post-war city burst into color. London became the epicenter of global youth culture. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, miniskirts, Carnaby Street, the sexual revolution. Art, music, and rebellion flowed from Soho to Notting Hill. The city felt young, electric, wild. But not everyone danced to the tune. Beneath the glamour, old inequalities lingered. Conflict, protest, and fire, 1970s, 1980s. Economic decline hit hard in the 1970s. Strikes shut down transport, energy, even grave digging. Tensions exploded in Brixton and Tottenham, where police brutality and systemic racism led to fiery riots. In 1981, Brixton burned. So did the illusion of harmony? Margaret Thatcher's government brought reforms. And resistance. London's working-class communities were reshaped. The IRA bombed the city repeatedly during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Each explosion reminded London. Peace is fragile. Progress is never guaranteed. London at the turn of the century, 1990s. By the 1990s, London was rising again. The financial district in Canary Wharf took shape. The Millennium Dome symbolized a fresh era. The Thames Barrier protected against rising tides. In 1997, Tony Blair became Prime Minister, promising a new future. And in 1999, after years of campaigning, London finally got its own mayor for the first time in modern history. But perhaps the greatest change wasn't in buildings or politics. It was in identity. By the end of the century, London was a truly global city. More languages were spoken on its streets than in any other capital. It was a city of mosques, synagogues, cathedrals, gurdwaras, and temples. A place where past and present collided and somehow kept moving forward. The 20th century nearly broke London. It was bombed, burned, starved, and shaken. And yet, in the rubble, it reinvented itself again and again. But the 21st century would bring new threats. Terrorism, pandemics, surveillance, climate change, and a digital revolution that would reshape how the city thinks, moves, and breathes. What does London become when the old rules no longer apply? Part 5. Part 5. The entire history of London. London in the 21st century, crisis, identity, and reinvention. 2000 to 2025. The clock struck midnight on the year 2000. The world didn't end. But London, like every global city, would enter a new age. Faster. Louder. More connected. More divided. The past was still in its bones. But the future was knocking. Hard. A new millennium, architecture, identity, and growth. The skyline of old London was changing. Glass and steel towers rose above ancient streets. The Gherkin. The Shard. The London Eye. A city of Victorian charm was becoming one of ultramodern spectacle. The Tube expanded. Oyster cards replaced paper tickets. And mobile phones became as common as umbrellas. The city buzzed with tourists, tech, and tension. But behind the booming skyline, inequality widened. Terror on the underground, 7/7 attacks. On July 7, 2005, the morning commute became a nightmare. For suicide bombers detonated explosives on 3 tube trains and a bus. 52 people were killed. Hundreds injured. It was the deadliest attack on London since World War II. Grief hung heavy in the air. But once again, the city didn't retreat. Flowers covered King's Cross. Muslims and Christians mourned side by side. And Londoners kept riding the trains. Because they always had. Because they had to. A global city, diversity and division. By the 2010s, London was the most diverse city in Europe. Nearly 40% of its residents were born outside the UK. You could hear over 300 languages on its streets. It was celebrated as a melting pot. But some saw it differently. In 2016, the UK voted for Brexit to leave the European Union. London voted overwhelmingly to stay. It was a sign. The capital was no longer in sync with the rest of the country. The divide between urban and rural, young and old, global and local, had never felt sharper. Lockdown, the pandemic era. Then came 2020. A virus. An invisible enemy. COVID-19 emptied the streets like no bombing ever had. Oxford Street, silent. Heathrow, still. Pubs, parks, theatres, shuttered. For months, London held its breath. NHS workers became heroes. Balconies echoed with clapping. Face masks became fashion. The city adapted. It always had. But the scars remained. Economically. Emotionally. Socially. London emerged changed. Quieter. More digital. More cautious. But also more reflective. Protest and purpose, identity reclaimed. Amid the silence, voices rose. In 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement surged through the capital. Statues were defaced. Histories re-examined. Questions asked that had been buried too long. Whose city is this? Who gets to belong? Who gets remembered? Suddenly, London's past empire, slavery, colonialism wasn't just in museums. It was alive. Contested. Real. The city stood on the shoulders of its history. But now, it was rethinking those shoulders. Reinvention, culture, climate, and the digital shift. As the world shifted, so did London. Theaters reopened cautiously. Remote work emptied the city on Fridays. Cyclists replaced car horns. The ULEZ, ultra-low emission zone, expanded, forcing a greener city. The Elizabeth Line launched in 2022, decades late, but finally linking east to west. Art bloomed again, from South Bank to Shoreditch. TikTok kids danced where punk bands once rioted. The city remained a paradox. Old books and new startups. Hijabs and bowler hats. Historic pubs beside vegan cafes. The AI age, new power, new questions. By the mid-2020s, a new revolution emerged, not with steam or steel, but with code. Artificial intelligence. London became a hub for global AI innovation. Startups popped up in King's Cross and Shoreditch. Universities scrambled to lead. The government struggled to regulate. Was this a new industrial revolution or a digital empire in disguise? For London, the question wasn't just how to compete. It was how to stay human. A city in flux, 2025 and beyond. Today, in 2025, London stands at a crossroads. It is still the capital of the UK, but it often feels like a nation of its own. A city where million-pound penthouses overlook food banks. Where you can walk from Roman walls to African churches in 5 minutes. Climate change looms. Migration continues. Tech reshapes everything. But the soul of London? That strange, stubborn spirit? It remains. It's in the sound of Big Ben echoing through fog. In the smell of rain on brick. In the faces on the tube at rush hour, tired, determined, dreaming. London isn't easy. It never was. It is chaotic, loud, divided, glorious. A city built on conquest and survival. On royalty and rebellion. On stone and story. It has burned, it has drowned, it has been bombed and broken. But it endures. Because London is more than a place. It is an idea. A living, breathing experiment in what happens when the world meets in one place. And decides to carry on, anyway. This was the entire history of London. From muddy riverbanks to global capital. A story still being written. By every footstep on its streets. Please subscribe.